was saying to the panelists, this is one of my greatest joys is putting this together because I get to meet these people and work with an amazing staff downstairs in the Children and Teens Department. Last week we celebrated DIA. We counted down to April 30th. We worked very hard to be part of We Need Diverse Books. And then at the end of this week, yesterday, Andrea Davis Pinckney gave the Arbuthnot lecture in Minnesota. That's the kind of things that happen in the world of children's books every day. So we're kicking off this week with a panel on nonfiction picture books. So let me introduce everyone. As I said to them, if I had to give them their due, it would be an hour before I would finish with each of them. So we welcome back Leonard Marcus, whose countless contributions to children's literature are invaluable, and who guarantees that we have a history of those who have led the way and those who continue to do so. Leonard is in constant demand for his presentations and as to be a curator of many exhibits. And I encourage all of you to make your way to the New York Public Library to see the ABC of it, Why Children's Books Matter. This exhibit was extended before it even opened. And its final extension is September 7th, so get on a bus and get there. His book, Dear Genius, will be published in China this spring, and he's in the midst of preparing lots of PowerPoints for his presentations in Asia. And as Leonard said in one of the tweets when he announced that, Ursula Nordstrom rules. This year he added to his published works the Randolph Caldecott, The Man Who Could Not Stop Drawing, and Maurice Sendak, A Celebration. Susan L. Roth, our next in line. I'm just going to walk my way down the panelists. Last year I did it in alphabetical order, and I think it caused a great deal of problems for the videotaping. Susan has been publishing since 1988 and has been awarded many times for her excellent work. She's an author and an illustrator, as well as a collaborator, and is responsible for exceptional works of nonfiction and picture books that address science, geography, and biographies. Her most recent collaboration, written with Cindy Trombone and illustrated by Bohr, sorry. Oh, that's my typo. And illustrated by Susan, won the 2014 Cybert. Her many books can be found in all kinds of great collections, and I discovered that her book, Do Re Mi, is part of the Vatican's library. All but 2 of her 40 books have been done in collage. Her website celebrates her love of collage, and you must visit it because it's really an interesting experience. You tap on a picture, and that tells you a story. Her tools are scissors, tweezers, paste, and tape, and her works are created from ripping and cutting. Her life began in New York City, and college took her to California. She returned to the East Coast and began teaching in inner city DC. And the piece of trivia I learned about Susan is that she's never been known to leave home without a camera. I don't know if that's still true or not. Next in line is R. Gregory Christie. Gregory has a rich heritage of Louisiana Creole and Jamaican. He's originally from New Jersey and now resides in Georgia. He's been an illustrator for over 20 years, and I think we can safely say that his work changes in amazing, vibrant ways with each and every subject. He's illustrated over 50 books and is a 3 times recipient of the Coretta Scott King Award, his first being Brothers in Hope, the story of the lost boys of Sudan. Gregory's illustrations have graced album covers, the 2013 Kwanzaa Forever stamp, and he has had such clients as The New Yorker, Rolling Stone, Wall Street Journal, the Kennedy Center, Pete Seeger, just a few of the names. He now owns and runs Gas Art Gifts, a bookstore in Decatur, Georgia. GAS stands for Gregarious Art Statements. As it is a space where art is appreciated and creation intersects. It's all wrapped into this bookstore with signed children's books, an art school, and an art gallery. And oftentimes he would get back to me at the end of the day because he's been teaching. So we're really glad he's here. Next in line is Jen Bryant, who is an author of picture books, novels, and poems. Today we celebrate her nonfiction picture books. She's been recognized with numerous awards, most recently the Cyber Honor and the Schneider Family Award for A Splash of Red, and a Caldecott Honor for A River of Words, which is one of my favorites. She was a French major with a minor in German and secondary education from Gettysburg College, and we're really delighted that she left that career and began writing when her children were quite young, actually. An interesting piece of trivia about her is that she finds that one of the best places to write, and I don't know if this is still true, is in her car, because that's where she would write when she was driving her children around who would fall asleep, and then she could write. And I think, like all good teachers, her writing reflects her commitment to capture ideas, mold them, and so that they entertain and they inform. She finds real people and real events are her greatest interest, and her work confirms that. Trivia note about Jen is that she's a long list of other jobs, which have included being a bank teller and also a member of a road crew. Next in line is Duncan Tonatiuh. Duncan, from his very first works, he has received critical acclaim. He received a Pura Bel Pre for his first book, Dear Primo, and subsequently Pura Bel Pre Awards and the Tomas Rivera Mexican Award for Pancho Rabbit and the Coyote, as well as Diego Rivera. And just this month, the Anti-Defamation League has named Separate is Never Equal as Book of the Month. And we have to thank Abrams because they released the book in time for all of you to be able to have it today, because it's really due out May 6th. As an illustrator and author, his books bridge the cultural divide between the States and his native Mexico. His name suggests the passion and the commitment he brings to his art and his support of social justice. As he has said, Duncan can be translated as the Dark Warrior, and Tonatiuh is the name of the Aztec god of the sun, and that certainly reflects his inspiration of art from the Aztecs, the Mayas, and the Mixtec traditions. His clients also include the Journal of Children's Literature at McGraw-Hill, the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health. And I learned that he also does silk screening of T-shirts and bags, and is really looking for someone to help take that over for him. I would love that because they're beautiful. Next in line is Richard Jackson. We are incredibly honored to have Dick with us today. He is the editorial director of Richard Jackson Books from Atheneum, and after 43 years in publishing, he retired in 2005. Dick is really responsible for discovering some of the most significant authors in youth literature. Besides Bryant, Floca, who's right beside him, how about Judy Blume, Paula Fox, George Ella Lyon, Virginia Hamilton, Chris Rashka, and Angela Johnson. The writers he has supported have broadened the range of topics in children's literature and in multicultural publishing. He co-founded Bradbury Press in 1968, Orchard Books in 1986, DK Inc. in 1996. And since his retirement, his books have already received a Newbery, a Caldecott, and 4 Cybert honors. There's a list this long of the other awards he's received over time. So, and 3 of his own picture book texts will be published by Atheneum in 2016, which is very exciting. And certainly not last, but least, what am I trying to say? Bryant. Bryant Floca is both an author and an illustrator of books that have always been recognized for their excellence. Most recently, Locomotive was the winner of the Caldecott and a Cybert honor. In addition to the books he has authored and illustrated, he has also illustrated books for Avi, Kate Mesner, Lynn Cox, Jan Greenberg, and Sandra Jordan. His newest book, which is coming from Lynn Cox, Random House promised would be here today, and unfortunately we didn't get it. So come back, because we will have probably the only copies of Elizabeth, Queen of the Seas. So we'll have those for you tomorrow, probably. While at Brown, Brian took classes at the Rhode Island School of Design that led to studies with David Macaulay. And that led to Avi, and that led to Richard Jackson. As his other colleagues on this panel do, and I think we'll hear more about that, he is an amazing, thorough, and complete researcher of each and everything he does. And I know, having talked to some of his mates from the art gallery that they share, that he's always working. And the trivia point I have for him is that he once answered phones as a part-time job for Harvard University. So just a little bit of housekeeping. I will come back up after the panel, and we will do a little bit of movement of things. I'll come back and remind you about all of this, but the important thing is to fold your chairs up and put them near something that's solid. We'll have books for sale at the registers, and I think that's about it. It turns out today is Star Wars Day. So the force be with you, I guess. Anyway, so I'll turn it over to Leonard.
Okay, well, can you hear me, I hope? Yeah. Thank you all for being here. Nonfiction is the kind of book that I always read growing up, and I have come to think that the kinds of stories that appeal to us are very reflective of our temperaments. There are those of us growing up who want to have answered the question, what if? And there were those of us who want to have answered the question, is it true? Some of us want to know the answer to both questions. But I think that nonfiction really appeals to something deep in a lot of people. Historically, it's had ups and downs in this country. In the 50s, it was a very hot thing, partly because America was afraid of the Russians, and that led to Congress appropriating a lot of money for the purchase of science and technology books for school libraries. In the 70s, it seems to have been a down period, and I want to read you a very brief passage from a book of mine which talks about the fact that none of the big awards then available to children's literature in America were ever going to nonfiction. And this passage, which relates to an article that appeared in the Hornbook in 1976 by Milton Meltzer, a very distinguished and prolific writer of nonfiction, was his comment, and it really did jumpstart people's thinking and lead to things like the Cybert Award eventually. So here, just briefly. Now, the 60s and 70s was a time of new realism in books for children, meaning many things. Marie Sendak talking about children's real feelings, Judy Blume doing that for older kids, and of course Dick Jackson had an awful lot to do with that. But here's what was missing. With so much attention focused on the new realism in fiction for grade schoolers and teens, it was logical to wonder why so little attention was being paid to the ultimate literature of realism, nonfiction. In an essay called Where Do All the Prizes Go? The Case for Nonfiction, a veteran contributor to the genre, Milton Meltzer, held the industry to account for its failure to recognize the artistry required to create memorable works of biography, history, or science. Marshalling an embarrassment of damning statistics and naive quotations, Meltzer made a compelling case for the underrepresentation at medal time, books belonging to this wide-ranging and ill-defined category. He cited Jane Langton, a novelist and awards judge, who had freely acknowledged to him that to offset their confusion and guilt in the matter, she and her fellow committee members had finally settled on a single nonfiction title to include on their list of 5 finalists for an unnamed major national prize, National Book Award. The judge had taken their decision, she recalled for Meltzer, out of, quote, sheer naked prejudice, personal bias in favor of fiction. Not every deep-seated prejudice that librarians and publishers had to think hard about concerned the issues of race and ethnicity. An entire class of books, the people who wrote and illustrated them, were being discriminated against as well. Well, things have changed again, and today we have the Common Core and a kind of mania, it seems, for nonfiction, seeming to swing wildly in the other direction. I mean, fiction has a lot to offer too, and we need to remember that. But we have this wonderful group of people, and I want to start by thinking about nonfiction as a literary form. I mean, it's not, as Milton Meltzer said, just the facts, ma'am. It's actually shaping the facts into a story. And the only difference, really, is that the nonfiction writer is under the obligation for the story to be a true story, as well as a good one. So I'd like to ask the panelists who have written books if they would maybe talk a little bit about what goes into shaping taking the facts of whatever the subject is they're interested in and shaping it into a story that would take the form of a picture book. And so, Brian, I wonder if maybe you'd like to start and choose one of the books, one of your books that you feel like talking about. It could be Locomotive or another one.
Well, I'll say I think I realized I was making nonfiction books very late in making Moonshot, and I remember I was up late one Sunday night, and the phone rang, and it was the Cyber Committee telling me I'd gotten a Cyber Honor Award for Lightship, and which was a wonderful and complete surprise. And I think in my mind I had been making picture books with Dick for 15 years at that point, and had always just been trying to make picture books. And some of those picture books were about real things in the real world and involved trying to get that material right. But they were just books that I happened to be making because that I was making because those things interested me. And the focus for me had always was and still is on just making the best picture book I can. And when that picture book is about real world material, making it as accurately as I can. I think in a way I was sort of even unaware of the fiction nonfiction divide and even how books were shelved in the store. So is that answering your question? I don't.
Well, it's in the general vicinity of my question. Yeah, but I mean, I wonder if you could say a little bit more about shaping material to make a story out of it.
It's the great sort of pleasure and challenge of making the books. The material, when you find a subject that you love and you want to spend time with, the material obviously has already given you enough to make you interested with it, but then it starts to demand very tricky things sometimes when you're in the middle of the book making Locomotive. I really started that book thinking it was really going to be about one locomotive and one crew, and we would follow them all the way on their journey, and the satisfying thing would be seeing that crew over the course of the journey and seeing them get to the end of their work. And was plugging merrily along in the book and realized that on the Transcontinental Railroad the engines and the crews would be changed several times as the train went along. And so that was my through line on which the book had been built, sort of blown to pieces.
Yeah. So you sort of bumped into a
so
fact that didn't quite work. Yeah.
The things that kind of get you into the book and let you think, oh, this is what interests me, this is what's going to make this possible, and give it an arc, sometimes fall away. And it's in those situations it's not an option to think, well, maybe this one crew just decided, what the heck, let's go all the way. So
okay, Susan, would you like to talk about this question?
Sure.
With one of your books in mind?
Yeah. Can you hear me too? Or move it over a little bit? Okay. I was actually, when you said this, I was thinking about a very old book of mine. I don't think it's here anymore. More? I'm sorry. Pick it up? I think I need to pick it up. Oh. How's this? Good? I was remembering a book which is no longer out of print, but it's an ebook now. It's called Buddha, and I'm sure it's not here. And so I'll tell you some of the things that occasionally help shape direction. The story of the historical Buddha doesn't end the way happily ever after for family life. So I cut it off early. That's one way to do it.
No, absolutely. Yeah, no, this is a very interesting question.
Because I don't like it when everybody doesn't live happily ever after, and my editor definitely didn't like it.
Yeah. Well, the last picture that you see in the Dolares picture book biography of Lincoln is Lincoln sitting in a rocking chair, looking very pleased with himself for having brought the Civil War to a successful conclusion. But we know that he was on his way to the theater. But in the 30s and 40s, you couldn't show that. You couldn't talk about that. And it raises a really significant question about where's the line between making a selection with the child in mind as it relates to the most the essential facts of the story. I mean, are there times when you can't tell a certain person's story because the story is too dark? Do you think there is such a thing?
Sure, there must be times like that. But there are times when you have to tell the truth, you know. There are only 11 parrots left. That's a fact. And people ate them, excuse me, but they did a long time ago. That's a fact. And they caught them, and those are not so pleasant facts that we could put in. But maybe it's nowadays we're given a little extra room.
Okay. Duncan, would you like to talk about this question? How you take facts that you've collected and shape a story out of it?
Sure. So I made a book about Silvia Mendez, and it's a story that I didn't know about till pretty recently, and it's a civil rights case that desegregated schools in California a few years before, 7 years before Brown versus Board of Education. And so in making that book, I had several challenges. Like the first one was how much to cover, so to speak, you know, where to end it, what to leave out. The story of Silvia Mendez is a very interesting story because she moved, she grew up in Santa Ana, California, and then moved to this farm in Westminster with her family. But they moved to Westminster because there was a Japanese American family that lived there that was sent to an internment camp. And so, you know, but I only had 40 pages to work with, so I decided that there was already so much information in the book for a young reader that I decided not to include that part. Or for example, the case, I focused on the initial trial because there was an appeal case. And so one of the big challenges for me was sort of trying to give the reader enough information without sort of overwhelming him with it, because especially with that book, there were, you know, I definitely had to mention some dates, some names, you know, some things that a child might not be used to, you know, about like a judge and a court. So for me, it was trying to balance all that information, but in a way that wouldn't weigh it down too much, and that it still was a story.
Yeah, it's really tough, isn't it? It's kind of like packing a suitcase or writing poetry. So Jen, would you like to talk about one of your books?
Yeah, and that's, for me, poetry helps a lot for me to find images and refrains. I don't have a method, really. Each book is a new journey, a new adventure, and my method, if there is one, is to slosh around in as much of that person's life and materials as I possibly can. And there's so much more, and we can probably all say this, so much more material and research that never gets into the book. It informs it somehow, but it never gets into the book. And you do have to decide. And just a few examples. My first picture book actually started when I showed some poems that I was writing about Georgia O'Keeffe and her experience in the Southwest. I showed them to my friend Eileen Spinelli, Jerry Spinelli's wife, who's a wonderful picture book author. And she looked at those poems, which I had written for a literary magazine, intending to send them off. And she said, "You need a beginning and an ending here, and this can be a picture book." And if you look at the front of the picture book, it's dedicated to her, because I didn't really make the connection between the poetry I was writing, which was mostly narrative and often about a real person, a real event. And actually, that's how I got into writing novels in verse. I was writing poems about the Lindbergh baby kidnapping trial, which happened to be in my hometown of Flemington, New Jersey. And I just accumulated them, and thought, wow, this could be a book. So for me, poetry, with its distillation, its very tight language, its lyricism, and the fact that it's image-driven often helps me focus. Yeah, I would say that's my biggest tool in that regard.
Yeah. I'm just wondering if immersing yourself in William Carlos Williams' was a particular help to you in that regard, since he was so good at distilling a story into a few lines.
Yeah, and that's I actually returned to him when I was actually writing the Lindbergh trial. I did a lot of that in the Westchester University Library, where I was an adjunct faculty member at the time, and it just so happened that his poems were in along a wall where I happened to work and select a desk, and he was the only poet they understood when I was in high school. And I'm from New Jersey, as is our Gregory here, and he was the only one I got because he talked about ordinary things in such a beautiful way. And so I started reading him again. And for me, I think Mary Alice mentioned that I work in my car. He worked in his car. I really believe that if you slosh around in the materials enough, the materials tell you where to focus. And with him, there were so many stories about him leaving a poor family's house at night after staying up with them all night to deliver a child, and they would give him a scarf and a casserole. I mean, what do you need to make up there, right? And so for me, just the integrity of these people's lives, I just try and share that, and I try and share it in an anecdotal way, which I think is accessible for children.
Sure.
Yeah.
Dick, can you talk about the editor's side of this question? Some of the issues involved in helping to shape, a big mass of factual material into a story.
Was that mass or mess?
Well, it's your choice.
We had a pretty good mess going on Locomotive because there was so much information.
We did soak in it.
We-
It's like you can at a party you can mingle or you can mangle. So same thing.
From my point of view, nonfiction is particularly interesting because it inspires terrific art. If you think about it, having an actual factual person to follow or to illustrate is a great beginning place. We now know what Horace Pippin looked like. But the context for Horace Pippin is entirely a riffing from the actual factual into the imagined spirit of Horace Pippin. If you look at that book about Horace Pippin, you'll see that somehow or other he is evoked. And that kind of illustration is a treat to work with. From my point of view, nonfiction's function is apart from educational, is that it is great for artists. But I want to read something that comes from a book flap of one of the books that's touted here, and it's a beautiful book. But just listen to this interesting thought from flap copy, which, believe it or not, is very hard to do and is probably neglected in the world, but editors wet over it. Only the tools of fiction could make a complete portrait. So we have nonfiction as a discipline, but we have it relying on the old-fashioned tools of fiction. I don't want to go on about that because other panelists can do so.
Well, that really leads to the next question I wanted to ask. And years ago, I lived near a botanical illustrator named Anne Ophelia Dowden. And one day she said to me, she was a watercolorist, and she said, I can show so many things in a watercolor that I could not show in a photograph. And that really stopped me because I had thought, as many people do, of photography as the ultimate art medium of realism. I mean, what could be more real than a photograph of something? So I want to ask all of the illustrators here to talk about this question. I'm curious as to whether you use photographs as reference sources, but beyond that, I wonder in what ways you feel that the kind of art that you do can be expressive in a way that a photograph perhaps cannot. Gregory, would you like to start?
Well, when it comes down to it, after a certain point, I have to throw the photograph away because it's confining to me. Painting, you can break boundaries, you can mess with proportion, and I always start with a photograph to look at the face and the eyes so you can capture the human element of what I'm painting. But then after a while I have to just let it go, and it's like an improvisation. You have to put your own human element into what you're doing, and you do that with color, and you do it with form and shape. And you know, colors do matter in terms of the moods that affects human beings. I mean, as hospitals are white, you keep away from green because it could be sickness or it could be life. You know, you really think about things. A lot of things go into your thought process when you're actually creating an image. But you have to go even further when you're dealing with children, because you want to keep things bright, but if you're getting back into something like a fiction book, you want to make sure that you're giving the story of these people or the person you're dealing with a dignity by honoring the truth. So you're doing a book about, for instance, about slavery, it's not going to maybe be like bright colors, and you know, there'll be parts of it that will have nuances in it to kind of just have a flow. So I mean, it's getting back to your question, the photograph is important to have a foundation, but then your talent as an artist and your interpretation of that photograph is what brings the book to life.
Sometimes the photographs are absolutely necessary. If, for me, on occasion, when I could not go to the places because of political reasons, and my only reference was the photographs that I was able to use. And in some respects, I feel not so lucky, because I feel so dependent, and I didn't really see it with my own eyes. And that's just the way it is. But then it affords a certain creativity, as you say, and the imagination does take over. It is required to take over. One of the nice things about nonfiction, though, is that a lot of the times nothing but the facts are allowed to be presented at the very end of the book, which is nonfiction. But you know, if, for example, there are illustrations in the first 30 pages, there could be a couple of spreads of photographs, and that's interesting, finally, as a way to compare, actually. And hopefully they would not be exactly.
And I just want to sort of follow up, and because you're so identified with collage as an art medium, do you understand for yourself what it is that has drawn you to that particular art medium?
Oh, absolutely. Impatience. I used to be a woodcutter. You know how to make a woodcut? First you have to make a drawing, then you have to get a piece of wood, then you have to glue the drawing onto the wood, then you have to wait till it dries, then you have to cut it out, then you have to wash it off, then you have to wait till it dries, then you have to ink it, then you have to press it. Forget about it.
Okay. I was gonna come up with a completely different theory than that.
I'm a New Yorker now.
You're easing away from labor-intensive art very slowly, though.
That's right. The weaker I get. But by the way, I often use pieces of photographs in the collage. Is that cheating? Maybe.
So Duncan, you've embraced a traditional art form associated with pre-Columbian Mexico, and then sort of run with it and taken off. Would you talk a little bit about that, and in relation to, I don't know if photography comes into your work at all in terms of, but it probably does, in terms of research at least.
Sure. So yeah, I look. Thank you. So my artwork is very flat, very geometric. You'll see that the kind of ears on the characters look a little bit like the number 3, and I began doing that because I did this project about an undocumented Mexican worker that I was friends with in New York, but a lot of the undocumented workers there are Mixtecos, which is an indigenous group in Mexico. So I began looking at a lot of Mixtec artwork, and there's all these wonderful codex that were made hundreds of years ago, and that's sort of what got me drawing in that style, and I've really sort of embraced it and enjoyed drawing like that, to sort of continue that tradition and I think it's an interesting way of kind of depicting people, you know, and so, for example, with the book with Silvia Mendez, I definitely looked at sort of photographs of the time period to kind of get a sense of how people dress, what the cars look like, what the buildings look like, but then trying doing it in this very stylized sort of codex-like style, and I think it's something I've really enjoyed doing, sort of trying to take something that's kind of very ancient looking and something that's also sort of very modern looking. I do a kind of collage too, but I do it digitally, so there's definitely sort of photographic images that I kind of collage into the image, and again, it's sort of trying to balance that again with this nonfiction book of having some realism in it and being sort of accurate to some of what some of the clothing and the buildings were like, but then also making it stylized and making it in my own way to represent this kind of ancient tradition.
Yeah. And Brian, in some of your drawings, you're trying to show the reader how a machine works, you know. So thinking of that goal in particular, do you find that drawing is a better way to do that than photography? What would you say about that?
I do, and it's also a better way for me to actually understand those things myself. So one of the things I got to do while I was making Locomotive was I drove the transcontinental route, and I stopped at Promontory Summit, where they have 2 locomotives there that are built and painted the way the locomotives would have been built and operated and painted in 1869. And I mean, I had a camera and I took hundreds of pictures, and those were essential and a huge help. But I also took a few hours to just sit down there and draw those things, because you can take a picture of something without even looking at it. But you can't draw something that's in front of you without being made to try to understand what this shape is, how is it connecting here, and where is it going. And one of the great things about those locomotives is their workings are so visible. So it's all right there if you take the time to see it and look at it. And drawing is sort of a process that forces that on you.
Is that something that David Macaulay talked about when you were studying with him?
It's not, actually. I mean, I think it's something you just sort of absorb by osmosis through looking at David Macaulay's books. But the class I took with David Macaulay very briefly was called Think Now, Draw Later. And we would go into class, and he would put a phrase up on the board. And we would spend 1 hour trying to sketch a drawing that would evoke that phrase for someone who just walked cold into the room. And then we would spend the next 2 hours talking about why everyone's drawings either did or did not do that. And it would be about cropping, subject matter, the way you framed it, the tone you used, everything. And then we would break for lunch, and then we would do it again. So it was this very sort of fantastic, holistic take on what makes a picture do its job or not.
So this is a question maybe everyone could give a short answer to. Thinking of nonfiction picture books, do you think there is nonfiction for girls and nonfiction for boys, or does that line not exist? Susan?
I think they better get together on this one.
Okay. Does anybody else want to comment on that?
I don't. I'm drawn to whomever I'm drawn to, and I don't really think about. I don't really think about anything other than the human story, and I don't think about the audience. Is this going to appeal to boys more than girls?
Yeah.
I don't think about that at all. I just, I let the story, the essence of the story, the essence of the person, if it's a biography, which most of them are, just speak for itself, and whoever likes it, and that's okay.
Yeah.
And I think if you do it in a way that is a human story. Horace Pippin is one example.
Mm-hmm.
There is so much integrity and so much grace in his life. I can't imagine any human not finding something to identify with there. So I don't really worry about that.
I mean, there's so many pink books for children. I presume for mostly girls. I wonder if there isn't really some counterpart in the nonfiction world that maybe we're not so focused on.
Well, I do have a pet peeve of when you walk into not a wonderful independent bookstore like this, but some bookstores, and it has magazines, women's. I don't really want to read any of those. I don't, unless I'm forced to, sitting in a.
Yeah.
I understand. I mean, sure. I mean, I have, but to say these are for women,
Yeah.
and these other ones that deal with intellectual material are the other ones.
Mm-hmm.
I have a problem with that.
Sure. of
So I don't
course.
want to write books for like that, you know,
Okay.
for kids.
I could say a big part of what I do. I mean, you can, as an artist, you can work in galleries, you can sell your work directly to people. To choose to do picture books, it's to help people, and so I kind of do get outside of my head when I'm doing a book and think about how somebody who never sees themselves or doesn't feel important could see themselves in a way as a hero. And like I did a book on Muhammad Ali, and it's pink. So it's a boxing book, and I sent it to him. He was happy. He didn't get mad. So, you know. But, well, actually, what happened is I sent it to him, and he sent a letter back, and it said, "Dear Mr. Christie, thank you for doing a book about my favorite subject, me." That's all I said.
That's great.
But you know, I only do picture books that I wish I had when I was a kid. Whether it's boys or girls, it's like there's so many stories that there's sometimes an imbalance, and there's so many in the curriculum. They might just rotate the same people over and over. So it's nice to have a book, whether it's a boy or a girl. You know, for boys, I don't really think this is for boys, this is for girls. But I know that certain books will, like there's a book called Keep Climbing Girls with Bea Richards. And that really is for girls. It was done. The poem was written in the 1950s, and there's one line in the poem I don't think we could get past an editor today. It said, it basically was saying it was a little girl that's climbing up a tree, and no matter how much they tell her to come down, she's saying, "I'm going to keep climbing." And then she gets to a top of a bough of a tree, and she looks and she says, doesn't she know, come down, that's really crazy. Doesn't she know that little boys have the upper hand in this world? So I don't think we could. Nowadays, we can't write that, but that's 1950s, just blatant put it out there. But I know when I did that book, I think it's gonna help girls, and I don't think that's right or wrong, and I don't. Maybe in one sense, when you have a book like that, it's gonna just open up a discussion, and maybe boys can understand something in a different. We can't always be thinking out of our own head, is what I'm getting at.
So I think we just have a little more time. Then we're going to have questions from everyone else. I want to ask Duncan, since you divide your time between this country and Mexico, I have a sense that Mexico is in an exciting time for picture books. There's some publishing going on there now. I was wondering if you could tell us anything about that and what your impression is of why the U.S. is sort of behind in offering books for children in this country for whom Spanish is their first language.
Sure. So yeah, I spend most of the year in Mexico these days, and there's a couple of very good book fairs. There's one in Guadalajara every year, and there's a children and young adult literature book fair in Mexico City every year that I try to go to. And there's some great publishing house in Mexico. There's some I think there's very good quality in terms of, they're very careful with the editions, very beautiful books. But a lot less books get printed. It's smaller print runs, and, a book in Mexico costs about the same that it costs here in the U.S., but people in Mexico earn a lot less money. So it becomes a much more precious object that is usually just more like middle and upper class people who get access to it. So sometimes, even though I think there are a lot of beautiful books in Mexico, sometimes I feel they're more for adults than for children. I feel there's something more to, put up, and you don't want the kid to mess it up. But I do think that there's some really interesting things that are done there, and I'm not sure. I mean, I get asked a lot of why so far my books are in English here, published in the U.S., and there's definitely a lot of interest in different places, especially in the Southwest, where there's a lot of Latinos and Mexican Americans, and having the books in Spanish. And I'm not quite sure why there's not more of that. I think publishing with the whole ebook and all that is not as willing to take some risks, and I think there's a big market and a big need there, but I don't think publishing houses are eager to take the risk on because they don't know exactly, they have their way of doing things and selling books and don't know how to access that market. But I think, I wish there were more crossover. There's a lot of crossover between books in Mexico and like Spain and Europe and South America, but not so much with the United States, and same vice versa, even though it's right here, and even though the culture penetrates so much both ways, that I wish the books also, went back and forth a lot more.
Dick, I'd like to ask you if you would talk a little bit about Chris Rashka, who I think did some of the most unusual picture book biographies ever, and they sort of straddle so many different lines. It's almost hard to decide where to place them in the universe of picture books. But Charlie Parker and the book about Thelonious Monk and others.
Well, Chris's impulse, if you know any of those books, you know that he is a musician. You know it just by the look of the book. The books are intensely musical. The language that he, in many cases, devised for these books is a spin on the music of jazz, the rhythms, the whatever. He is actually a genius, I think, and he goes off in his own directions with no urging whatsoever. If, for example, you question a picture that is translated from dummy to finish, and you say, well, it really isn't working, whatever, he will go home and repaint the entire book. Not because you are so forceful, but because his interest is always getting the essence of that moment onto his drawing pad. The fund of artistic inventiveness is endless with him. So he really can do what most of us cannot do, which is take a completely different view of a subject that he's already thought of for 6 months or 6 years, as the case may be. So the music books, they're biographies, but you don't learn much about this factual. You learn the spirit of the person, and that's what he's about. And I think he communicates, though his language is exquisite, he communicates sort of below the language. And that's one of his great gifts, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So maybe we have time for one more question, do we? Yeah, okay. So it seems to me that in the realm of picture book biographies, the subject matter, the possibilities have really opened up quite a bit in recent years. And I was wondering if, Jen, maybe you would like to talk a little bit about that, and how, if it's still hard to put across, to make the case for certain subjects, or if the field is wide open because of core curriculum or for other reasons.
Sure. The subjects I've never responded or written because of trends or themes or something out there. I always have been drawn in by a person's life. Georgia O'Keeffe. I mean, I have no interest in trends. I wrote a picture book about Marianne Moore, Olivier Messiaen. Most people just sort of glaze over when you say, who are they? But I was fascinated by certain aspects of their lives. Those books are out of print now, and they were published by Erdmans. But so I didn't really weigh. And maybe they would be even more popular now, because now we're getting through, we've done a lot of folks who would be more in the mainstream, and we're getting to folks, as you mentioned earlier today, but like Eric Satie and
Stein.
Yeah, Gertrude Stein, and
There aren't too many adults who read Gertrude Stein.
right, exactly. And I think again, it's as everyone has said, it's the way that it's done as much as who it is. And again, taking someone like Georgia O'Keeffe, when I proposed that book to the publisher, there were already a lot of books out about Georgia O'Keeffe. But the way that it was done, because I was connecting her early girlhood quirkiness and her habit of taking her mother's homemade donut and walking around the farm and looking at things through it. Yeah. Later on, if you know her bone paintings, that's exactly what she did. She would take a bone of an animal and you would see flowers around it, or you would see a distant mountain. I mean, making these connections for kids, and it's important to take time to see things and to have your own vision. That was, as Dick said, that's the essence of that book. It's as much about that as it is about her life. And I guess with Horace Pippin, initially that manuscript, an earlier version of the manuscript, was rejected by the same folks who ended up publishing it. In fairness to the editor, it wasn't exactly the same manuscript. I didn't have quite as much material about his early life. I had a little bit more about the war. I had already written Olivier Messiaen, the Quartet for the End of Time, Music for the End of Time, if you're familiar with that. That's a World War II story. And I'm an undertaker's daughter. I don't avoid darkness. So I have no problem with that. But I think, again, the way that the Horace Pippin book is done, war was the pivotal experience of his life, and of course affected his art. And today he would have probably been diagnosed with PTSD, but he just knew that would heal him emotionally and physically. And so Melissa, in her mastery, had a wonderful way of including that difficult material, as Susan said earlier. You have to tell the truth. He did go to war. He was shot. He had a steel plate in his right arm. But the way that she shows that and shares that with the children through her art, it is on a child's level, and it's dark, but it's not overwhelming, and it's not without hope. So
Great.
I guess
Susan, would you like to say something about this subject, and then we'll have questions from everybody.
Okay, a little bit. First of all, we are dependent and beholden to our editors and publishers, and we have to respect their feelings, and we can't operate very well without them, so we either do it or don't. And many times it has been, in my experience, that the publisher knew many things that I didn't think about, and they were quite right. I was thinking in particular before about one book written with Karen Leggett Aburaya, who happens to be right there, our book about Egypt. And we had great visions about talking about the Alexandria Library and wanted to give many more details than we were invited to give. And and we were ushered here and ushered there. And as you all know, things got very complicated in Egypt. And whoever would have thought that? Well, I didn't, but apparently my editor did. Karen's editor did. So I think there are times when one has to be limited in spite of oneself. But I don't know. Lines are hard to accept. When you were talking about girls versus boys, I was thinking about adults versus children. And I wish that I don't write for children per se. I really would like to write, period. I don't know about the rest of you guys. You, yes. Is that an answer? Yeah. Okay.
Okay, so who has a question or a comment? Very good.
Well, as the staff knows, I come here a lot and look at picture books downstairs right below us. And I've noticed over the years the most powerful books for me anyway are the biographies, especially to pick one that really sticks in my mind, the one on John Coltrane that came out 1 or 2 years ago. And I wish I could remember the artist. Maybe Heidi or Emily remember, but the art really made the whole book dance, and of course, John Coltrane made a lot of people dance, and I think it was a very good combination. So my question is, for any of you folks sitting up front, is there a picture book that sticks in your mind because it's so powerful?
Well, I mean, one of my choices would be Charlie Parker, Chris Rashka's book, which is you sort of have to turn it every which way to follow what's happening, and it has so much music in the pictures. Anybody else?
The Coltrane book is called John Coltrane's Giant Steps, and it is by Chris Rashka.
There you go.
Oh, probably. I don't know, but I don't know that it's any others that are picture books. I don't know.
Just very graceful.
Oh, it's very graceful. Yes, yes.
Okay, here we have another question.
Hi, thank you so much for putting this on today. My question's about how you guys approach the author's note, and how you approach it for kids to be accessing it after without being reminded to check out the author's note.
Anybody?
I'll go after that. I think the author's note in my books have grown steadily from Lightship to Moonshot to Locomotive, and I think they sort of started off as wanting to keep the core text of the book simple, straightforward, but knowing that the book was going to raise questions for the kids and wanting to give the parent or the librarian or the teacher a sort of cheat sheet to be able to answer those questions. And I think they've continued in that spirit, but they've grown as I learn how much real estate I can be given for them.
In my case, my books so far have had author notes, and I guess I usually try and put a little bit of like the inspiration or the motivation. So, for example, with the Mendes book, I tried to put the story in context, saying what happened after the Mendes family won this trial, and but also some of the reasons for me of why I decided to make this book. And so in that case, it was sharing. That's a very important piece of American history that very few people know about, and that I thought that it was important to share it, and also with that book that even though there's something that happened to 70 years ago, schools are very segregated still nowadays. Legal segregation is not allowed, but schools are very segregated, and so I just wanted to, talk about that and give a few statistics about that, because that was one of the main reasons why I wanted to make that book.
Well, that was, I think, a really interesting question. Yeah, Karen, you go ahead now.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah, I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about any of the panelists about the impact of the Seibert Medal on the publishing of nonfiction picture books.
Pretty fancy, pretty fancy.
I don't know. I mean, I think it's been a help. It's helped sort of legitimize and define what we're doing and create a space for it, and encourage us, give us that little thread of hope to keep making nonfiction books. And it's great.
And it does encourage sales, actually. Notoriety is generally good, even if it's negative notoriety.
Okay, let's have the next question.
Hi, many of you have done books about topics that are complex or difficult, or in some cases political. And I just wondered, I'm thinking, Duncan, too, of Poncho Rabbit, which was an incredibly brave book to do, I think, in a lot of regards. I just wondered if there's a point as authors and illustrators where you've sort of hit against a point where you really had to make decisions about what you felt comfortable putting on the page for a young audience, or where you felt like it was an act of bravery for you to be covering a particular subject.
Well, with that book, Pancho Rabbit and the Coyote, coyote is like has two meanings: the name of an animal, but it's slang for a person that smuggles people across the Mexico-U.S. border. So it's a book about that, and I mean, I knew there's been a tiny bit of backlash, like someone put a review on Amazon that this is liberal propaganda or things like that. But in general, I think the response has been very positive, and I think people realize that this is the reality, and that, there's an estimated 1.5 undocumented children in the U.S., so this is the reality of a lot of kids here, and I think that people appreciate that there's book talking about that and commenting on it. So I just thought it was something, it's not my personal experience, but it's the experience of people around me, and I thought it was important to talk about it, and I think people have responded positively.
Umberto Eco, who's now in his 80s and has access to lots of students, says that he still does his own research because how else would he make the sweet discoveries? I wondered if each of you might share a sweet discovery you made in your research that either you used in your book or passed by, but it was still a sweet discovery.
I didn't mention Melissa Sweet and I have collaborated on a book that will be available in September on Peter Mark Roget, the man who wrote the Thesaurus. And this kind of also touches on your author note question too, which is so interesting to hear. For me, it can serve a number of functions, and in that book there was so much. These lives are so big sometimes, and these people are so diverse in their interests, particularly at that time. Peter Mark Roget was a physician. He ended up being a doctor by the time he was 17. He knew several languages. He worked in optics. He was a naturalist. You can't put all of that in the book. And so the author's note is a place where you can dump some of the stuff that you found out. And my little nugget was that he a few days after he was married, he was sitting in his kitchen. It was below street level, and he had Venetian blinds, and they were only partially open to let in the morning sun, and the wagons were going by, the wagon wheels. And he noticed that as the wagons would go by, the wheels seemed to bend. And this, what happened from that, what resulted from that is he wrote a paper on optics, and it became the foundation for what we now know as movies, is that the eye will perceive a series of still images as one continuous image. And so you could make a whole book just about that, in fact.
Would anybody else like to answer that question?
I'll just say, like, I probably could have done Locomotive or some version of it without driving across the country, but that was just one of the most fantastic weeks I've ever had, crossing that country, seeing the landscape change, experiencing what I wanted to convey in the book. And yeah, I would not have assigned that to anyone else for anything.
Yeah, I'll talk a little bit about 10th century or 11th century and Guido d'Arezzo, who I could not interview, you might know. But sometimes when you do research about somebody even who's not here to tell the tale, the peripheral people make it so interesting, and it's true. Driving across country or driving across Italy, it's the same idea. And I wouldn't give it up for anything, and it's too bad when it's not possible to do that, not to give up the books that we have to be even more inventive about, but it is wonderful to be able to have a first-hand experience with our work.
Well, on a very, very real level, I work with Reading is Fundamental. We focus all of your books, and this year about 3,200 copies have gone into the poorest classrooms in the poorest counties in the country. And I will tell you, we brought Mr. Christie up in February and we broadcast him to the poorest places. If you looked at the 100 poorest counties in the country, that's where he was featured. I went to one of those places, no road signs, you can't use your phone or your GPS. And I walked in, and the teacher said, "Were you scared?" Well, I thought they were talking about getting to where they were. And I said, "Oh, no, I'm from the South. I'm not afraid of these places." They said, no, about being on TV with the author and the illustrator. And our children got the book, and this book was Philip Reed Saves the Statue of Freedom. If you haven't seen that, it's wonderful. It's about the statue on the Capitol building. I had teachers from these places tell me that none of their children had ever been to Washington, D.C. None of the families had ever been to Washington, D.C. And vocabulary, this is mundane and boring, but I have to say it, vocabulary that your children know and my children know, their children don't know. And through your wonderful nonfiction books, we can support little children learning vocabulary in interesting ways. I went to the middle of nowhere. Second grader says, "We're reading about summer butterflies." Another little kid says, "That's a metaphor." In medieval times, they didn't know what those were. Those children were 7 years old. If I told you where they were, you'd have never heard of it, and you couldn't find it. So I just say thank you very much.
Hi, I work in the schools around here, and I just want to say, when I was growing up, Madame Curie was like a huge, there weren't that many, especially about women. But so the other day I read this book, and this book is just wonderful. The illustrations are just incredible. And I mean, these are second graders who barely ever stop talking and moving, but they were transfixed by this book. And I think part of it is that illustrations are like watching a movie, because you had to illustrate so many different facets of this man's life, which no one knew about him. And oh, sorry. Yeah, no one knew. I mean, I didn't know about it, but they were just incredibly, and the morality of him came so through in the pictures and the words. But we were unclear because we were reading it and we didn't know what a posse was. And actually, it turns out that there's a glossary in here that and also there's a lot of resources for other books on the same subject. But I just wanted to say thank you so much.
Comment on that. It's like that particular book. I knew about Bass Reeves from a book called The Black West, William Lawrence Katz, and it has all this information, but that's where you have to start with a photograph of just Bass Reeves, a very dignified looking man, handlebar mustache. It's a hard thing to make manly, so but the thing that was interesting is that you get into his life, you start to get into pre-Oklahoma history. Oklahoma didn't become a state till 1907. And it's like I think these books are tools for the classroom in order to it's a gateway into other discussions. So it's not just, you don't have to pigeonhole a book and say it's this month's book or that month or whatever it may be, or that subject matter. There's creative ways to really present the book to open up. And I'm with the belief you can do a book about anything. It's how you do it. It's how you do it.
It's not really a question. There was a lady here that was, I don't know where she went, but she was talking about how the children didn't know about what is a summer butterfly. And I'm an adult. That might not look like because I look so young. But that's not funny. Anyway, so this gentleman who's on the panel, he educated me through his artwork, and he's been doing that like my entire life. I'm not really one who tries to make people look good, but the guy educated me about Toussaint. Is it Toussaint? Yeah, so my children and I, we were sitting there while he were drawing, and I'm like, what are you doing? What's this guy? And he's explaining to me about how in school we're educated about how America gained the Louisiana Purchase, but they never really tell us that it was because Toussaint went to war with France, and he fought them, and he was so successful at it that guy, the short guy with the Napoleon complex, that guy, he had to sell the property so that he would be able to do whatever his country needed to do, but there wouldn't be any America without this guy. And it was so important that an illustrator was a historian. So I'm not really like, you know, I'm a quiet guy, I'm a funny guy, but I became educated because of illustration. And I became educated. It wasn't fiction, so I guess that was like, you know, fiction. How do you separate the two? But the man educated me as he was drawing, and I just want to say that about this guy here.
Let's give a great big round of applause for this amazing group.